What happens when the person accused of violence becomes the next name in a breaking alert? Not later. Not after a trial. Not after years of appeals. Now, 1 minute ago, according to an official confirmation attributed to former U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi, the story took a turn that few people were prepared for. Nick Reiner is dead. Not released. Not transferred. Dead. The cause, we're told, was an assault inside custody, allegedly carried out by other inmates. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And that's the moment where the room goes quiet. Because if you've been following this case at all, even casually, you know it was already heavy. 2 bodies found inside a multi-million-dollar Brentwood home. A son arrested. A family shattered in a single night. The kind of story that seems to resist neat explanations. But this new development doesn't simplify anything. It complicates it. Deeply. I want to slow this down. Deliberately. Because the most dangerous thing we can do right now is rush to conclusions. Or worse, let the shock pass over us without asking the uncomfortable questions that are already pressing in. A man awaiting trial. In state custody. Dead before his case could be heard. What does that tell us? And maybe more importantly, what does it not tell us? For days, the public narrative had been moving in one direction. Nick Reiner, 32, arrested the same night his parents, Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found stabbed to death in their Brentwood estate. Reports said the bodies were discovered by their daughter, Romy, 27, who allegedly warned police about a dangerous family member. The details were fragmentary, emotionally loaded, and already being shaped into a familiar arc: tragedy, suspicion, arrest. But this doesn't fit the arc. This disrupts it. Because now the person positioned at the center of the criminal case is no longer alive to answer questions, no longer able to testify, no longer able to contradict or confirm anything that's been said about him. And that should make all of us pause. Think about the timing for a moment. Think about how rarely cases reach this point. People die in custody, yes, but when it happens to someone at the center of a high-profile double homicide investigation, the implications ripple outward immediately. Legal, ethical, institutional, emotional. And yet the announcement itself arrived almost quietly. No dramatic press conference. No extended briefing. Just a confirmation. A few sentences. A cause attributed. And then silence. That silence is important. Because silence, in cases like this, is rarely accidental. If you're asking yourself why this story matters right now, the answer isn't just because it's shocking. It matters because it forces us to confront a collision between 2 systems that are supposed to operate very differently. The criminal justice process, which moves slowly, methodically, often painfully so, and the carceral system, where things can unravel in minutes, unseen, undocumented until it's too late. Somewhere between those 2 systems, a life ended. And we are told it was inevitable, random, the result of inmate violence. But is that explanation sufficient? Or is it simply the first version of events, offered before harder questions can take shape? Let me be clear about something before we go any further. This is not about exonerating anyone. It's not about rewriting what happened inside that Brentwood home or dismissing the seriousness of the charges that were filed. 2 people are dead. That reality does not change. What has changed is who gets to speak next. Because with Nick Reiner's death, the legal process did not just pause. It collapsed inward. There will be no cross-examination, no sworn testimony, no defense narrative tested in open court. Whatever version of events ultimately becomes official will be built without the voice of the person at the center of it. That should unsettle you, regardless of what you think you know about this case. Ask yourself this. How often do we accept official explanations simply because there is no longer anyone left to challenge them? And why are we so quick to move on? The reports say the attack happened inside custody. They say other inmates were responsible. They say it was fatal. But they don't say where exactly, or when warnings were first noticed, or what, if any, protective measures were in place given the profile of the detainee. Those omissions matter. Because anyone who understands how high-profile detainees are handled knows that nothing about their custody is supposed to be casual. Housing assignments, observation levels, separation protocols, all of it is designed, at least on paper, to prevent exactly this outcome. So when those systems fail, the question isn't just what happened. It's how many layers had to break down for it to happen. And that's where the story begins to feel heavier. You might be wondering why this confirmation came from Pam Bondi, why her name is attached to this update. That's not a coincidence either. Bondi's public profile, her history in law enforcement and national legal commentary, lends weight to the statement. Authority, finality. But authority does not equal completeness. In fact, authoritative statements often arrive at the moment when institutions are most eager to stabilize a narrative, to put a boundary around chaos, to signal that the situation is under control. Is it? Consider what we don't yet know. We don't know whether Nick Reiner had reported threats. We don't know whether there were earlier altercations. We don't know how long he was in general population or whether he should have been there at all. We don't know who reviewed his custody status or when. And perhaps most importantly, we don't know why the first version of events arrived before the investigation itself had time to breathe. If you've followed cases like this before, you already know the pattern. Early explanations harden quickly. Later corrections struggle to gain traction. The initial framing becomes the lens through which everything else is interpreted. That's why this moment matters. Because right now, the story is still malleable, still unsettled, still uncomfortable. And discomfort is where real questions live. Let's talk about the family, briefly, but carefully. The Reiners were not anonymous. Their Brentwood estate, valued at $13.5 million, places them squarely in a world of visibility, resources, and assumptions. People hear that price tag and start filling in the blanks themselves. Privilege, insulation, distance from danger. But violence doesn't respect those assumptions. And neither does grief. Imagine being Romy, discovering your parents' bodies, making that call to police, allegedly naming a dangerous family member. Imagine carrying that weight into the days that followed, only to have the story take this turn. What does closure even mean in a situation like this? There's a tendency, especially online, to flatten complex tragedies into morality plays. Heroes and villains, innocent and guilty. But reality is messier. It resists the neatness we crave. And now, with Nick Reiner's death, the mess has multiplied. Some people will see this as justice of a brutal kind. Others will see it as a catastrophic failure of the system. Most will feel something harder to name, a sense that something essential has been lost, regardless of guilt or innocence. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened inside that facility. Investigations will be announced. Reviews will be promised. Language will be careful, legal. But history tells us that internal accountability processes often move slowly, if at all, once public attention fades. So here's the question I keep coming back to, and I want you to sit with it too. If the justice system exists to determine truth through process, what happens when the process is cut short? Not delayed, not appealed, ended. And who benefits from that ending? As we move forward in this story, we're going to trace the timeline backward and forward at the same time. We're going to look at what was happening in the hours before the arrest, in the days after, and in the moments inside custody that are now being reduced to a single line in a confirmation. We're going to ask why certain details surfaced immediately, while others have not surfaced at all. We're going to examine how narratives are shaped when silence becomes a substitute for answers. Because this is no longer just a story about a crime in a Brentwood home. It's a story about what happens when the system meant to deliver justice becomes part of the unanswered question. Why did the confirmation come when it did? That's the detail that keeps nagging. Not loudly, not insistently, just enough to stay there, tapping at the edge of the story, refusing to be ignored. Because confirmations don't exist in a vacuum. They arrive at a moment, chosen or forced. And this one arrived at a time when the case against Nick Reiner had barely begun to take shape in the public imagination. Charges had been filed. Headlines had settled into place. The narrative was forming, not complete, but recognizable. And then, suddenly, the narrative was interrupted. Dead. That word changes everything. It doesn't just add a new chapter. It erases the center of the book. When the confirmation attributed to Pam Bondi began circulating, it didn't come with context. It didn't come with a timeline you could trace easily. It came as an endpoint, presented as fact, with just enough explanation to close the door. Fatal assault. Other inmates. Custody. 3 phrases. Heavy ones, but also vague enough to invite questions rather than answer them. If you're wondering why an official voice would step in so quickly, you're not alone. Typically, in-custody deaths trigger a familiar sequence. Preliminary notice, internal review, statements carefully hedged with ongoing investigation. Language slows things down, buys time. This didn't feel like that. This felt conclusive, almost eager to be. And that's not an accusation. It's an observation, a subtle difference, but an important one. Because in cases like this, the first framing often becomes the permanent one. Inmate violence is a phrase that does a lot of work. It suggests randomness, unpredictability, a danger that belongs to the environment rather than to any decision made within it. But environments are managed, structured, designed. So when something goes wrong inside them, the question isn't just who threw the punch. It's who decided who stood next to whom, who decided what risks were acceptable, who decided what warnings mattered and which ones didn't. Those decisions don't happen in a vacuum either. Let's stay with the timing a little longer. Nick Reiner had not yet been tried. Evidence had not yet been tested. The defense had not yet spoken in full. The prosecution had not yet laid out its case beyond the charges themselves. The story, legally speaking, was at its very beginning. And yet, the person who could have complicated that story the most was gone. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. It should. Not because it implies conspiracy, but because it highlights fragility. The fragility of truth when it depends on systems working as intended. The confirmation created a strange emotional whiplash. For some, it felt like grim closure. For others, like an open wound torn wider. And for many, something in between, a sense that the ground had shifted before anyone had found their footing. There's also the matter of authority. When a former Attorney General's name is attached to a statement, it carries weight even if the office is no longer held. It signals seriousness, legitimacy, finality. The implication is that this is not rumor. This is not speculation. But legitimacy doesn't preclude scrutiny. In fact, it demands it. Because the role of journalism, especially in moments like this, is not to amplify official language, but to examine it, to ask what it clarifies and what it conveniently leaves out. For instance, we're told Nick Reiner was beaten by other inmates. That phrasing assumes proximity, opportunity, a breakdown in supervision or separation. But we're not told whether he was in general population. We're not told how long he'd been there. We're not told whether he'd been flagged as vulnerable. And that's where things get complicated. High-profile detainees, particularly those accused of serious crimes, are often considered at heightened risk. Not always protected perfectly, but monitored differently. Sometimes isolated. Sometimes placed under observation. Sometimes moved preemptively, precisely because of the volatile reactions their cases can provoke. So if those protocols existed here, why didn't they prevent this outcome? And if they didn't exist, why not? These are not theoretical questions. They are procedural ones. The kind that live in intake forms, classification assessments, internal emails. The kind that are rarely discussed publicly unless someone forces the issue. Right now, no one has forced the issue yet. The confirmation has, in a way, done the opposite. It has invited people to accept an explanation and move on. But moving on feels premature, especially when you consider how quickly the narrative around Nick Reiner hardened after his arrest. Within hours, he was framed as the central danger, the dangerous family member, the suspect who lived in the guest house. The proximity became symbolic. And symbols are powerful. They simplify. They persuade. But symbols can also obscure. Because the more tightly a story clings to a single figure, the less room there is to examine the system around him. And now that figure is gone. That absence will shape everything that follows. Investigators can still reconstruct events. Prosecutors can still review evidence. But the courtroom, the space where competing narratives are tested, will never exist for this case. That is not a small thing. Ask yourself how many questions you still have about what happened inside that Brentwood estate. About the hours leading up to the discovery. About the family dynamics hinted at but never fully explored. About the warnings allegedly given. Now ask yourself how many of those questions depended, directly or indirectly, on Nick Reiner being alive to respond. Silence has replaced that possibility. And silence, in the justice system, is not neutral. There's also the matter of public attention. The news cycle moves fast. Today's shock becomes tomorrow's footnote. Already, other stories are pushing in. other crises demanding focus. In that environment, an in-custody death can become just another grim statistic unless someone insists on slowing down. That's what we're doing here. Because buried inside this confirmation are multiple stories layered on top of each other. A family tragedy, a criminal investigation cut short, a custodial system under scrutiny, a public left with fewer answers than it had before, and none of those stories resolve neatly. It's tempting to think that the hardest part of this case happened the night of the killings, that everything since has been aftermath. But the truth is, the hardest part may be unfolding now, in the quiet spaces where accountability either takes root or quietly dissolves. Consider the reviews that will likely follow. Internal investigations, perhaps an independent inquiry. Language will be careful. Findings will be measured. Responsibility may be described as systemic, which often means dispersed until it's effectively invisible. And without a defendant, the spotlight dims. No trial means no daily headlines dissecting testimony, no cross-examination to surface contradictions, no verdict to anchor public memory. Instead, there will be reports, summaries, conclusions reached behind closed doors. Are you comfortable with that? I'm not asking that rhetorically. I'm asking it because discomfort is the appropriate response when a process designed to uncover truth is interrupted by violence. And this interruption raises another uncomfortable question. If Nick Reiner had lived, the system would have been obligated to protect his rights, even as it sought to prove his guilt. Now that he's dead, what obligations remain? To his family? To the victims? To the public? Or does responsibility quietly evaporate once there's no one left to prosecute? We've seen versions of this before. Cases where in-custody deaths are framed as unfortunate but unavoidable, where reviews find no evidence of wrongdoing while acknowledging areas for improvement. The language is familiar, reassuring on the surface, hollow underneath. What's different here is the intensity of the unresolved questions and the speed with which the story has been ushered toward closure. Too fast. That's the feeling. Not provable, not definitive, just off. And when something feels off in a case like this, it usually means there's more beneath the surface than we've been shown. In the next section, we're going to step closer to the machinery that surrounds someone like Nick Reiner the moment he enters custody. How the system sees him, classifies him, decides what kind of risk he represents to others and to himself. Because before there was an incident, before there was a confirmation, there were decisions. And those decisions may hold the key to understanding how this story veered so violently off course. What kind of person does the system think you are the moment the door closes behind you? Not who you are, not what you've done, not what you might have done, what you are reduced to on paper. Because that's where everything starts. Not with a guard, not with a cell, but with a form, a checklist. Boxes ticked quickly, sometimes too quickly, by someone who has never met you before and may never see you again. Risk level, profile, vulnerability, threat to others, threat to self. Those words carry consequences. Once a detainee enters custody, identity collapses into classification. And classification determines almost everything that follows. Where you're housed, who you're housed with, how closely you're watched, how quickly someone responds if something goes wrong. This is the part of the story most people never see. And it's the part we have to look at now. Because before there was an incident, before there was a fatal assault, before there was an official confirmation, there was a decision-making chain that quietly set the conditions. And those conditions don't announce themselves. They just exist. High-profile detainees are not supposed to be treated like everyone else. That's not favoritism. It's risk management. Their cases attract attention. Their names circulate. Rumors spread faster around them. Emotions run hotter. Other inmates notice. They always do. So the system is designed, at least in theory, to account for that. In theory, a detainee accused of a violent crime is usually flagged immediately, not automatically isolated, but assessed. Is this person likely to be targeted? Are they likely to provoke retaliation? Are there indications of mental distress, public notoriety, media saturation? Those assessments happen early. Sometimes within hours, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes under pressure. And pressure matters. Because intake decisions are often made when information is incomplete and time is short. Arrest happens at night. Staff are stretched. Supervisors rely on summaries. Details get compressed. Nuance evaporates. A high-profile suspect becomes just another line item. That compression is dangerous. You might assume that someone like Nick Reiner would have been placed under heightened protection by default. But default doesn't. Because sometimes, the seeds of what goes wrong later are planted right at the beginning. What was the night like when the system first touched him? Not the headlines. Not the statements. Not the blur of flashing cameras or the sudden storm of speculation. But the night itself. The one that set everything in motion. The night that changed a family, a household, and ultimately, a man's life inside custody. It began quietly, at least at first. Reports indicate the discovery of Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, was made by their daughter, Romy, 27. The moment she walked through that Brentwood estate and found the unimaginable is hard to imagine itself. But she didn't hesitate. She called the authorities. She allegedly identified a dangerous family member. That was the first concrete step in what would quickly become a legal and media maelstrom. Nick Reiner, living in the guest house, was arrested that very night. In some ways, the arrest was procedural, almost mechanical. A law enforcement response executed according to protocol. Yet the human weight of that night, fear, confusion, disbelief, is something that no form, no report, no press release can fully convey. When law enforcement arrives at a scene like this, they enter a world that's already charged with emotion. Every step is calculated, every glance noted, every word measured. The officers are trained to separate observation from judgment, to prioritize safety while securing evidence. But even the most seasoned professional cannot entirely remove the human factor. The living room where the bodies were discovered, the narrow hallways, the site of a home turned crime scene, all of that lingers. It imprints. It shapes perception. It influences the early reports that will eventually circulate to the public. By the time Nick Reiner was taken into custody, the public narrative had already begun forming. Dangerous family member. Suspect. Brentwood tragedy. These phrases were repeated, amplified, and solidified before a single charge was formally laid. The law may be methodical, deliberate. The press is not. The media clock ticks differently. And in that discrepancy lies tension. But let's return to the procedural side. Arresting someone is rarely instantaneous, especially in high-profile cases. Officers must coordinate. Warrants must be verified. Evidence must be secured. And all the while, the human subject, Nick Reiner, is processing, in real time, that his life has changed irreversibly. Inside the vehicle, inside the transport van, inside the intake area of a detention facility, the transition begins. From citizen to arrestee. From family member to suspect. From private individual to public figure. These are transformations imposed externally, but experienced internally in ways that are disorienting, destabilizing. And destabilization matters. It's not dramatic flair. It's a fact that psychologists and criminal justice experts will tell you. Sudden loss of autonomy, coupled with high stress and uncertainty, is an acute risk factor for later incidents. Every judgment call, every housing decision, every staffing choice is made against a backdrop of this vulnerability. That night, the first decisions inside custody were made. Which unit? Which classification? Which cell? Each choice sets the trajectory of what follows. A person may move from intake to general population within hours, or they may be placed in a segregated unit for observation. Risk assessment guides these decisions, but assessments rely on information that may be incomplete or inaccurate. A log misfiled, a warning overlooked, a verbal report not formally recorded. This is where tension begins to accumulate, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Because if someone is flagged as high risk, but placed where the system expects compliance, the mismatch doesn't announce itself. It waits until something goes wrong. Outside the legal and procedural framework, the family reacts. Romy's initial report, allegedly identifying Nick, is already shaping internal perception. Whether those observations are accurate or speculative is secondary to the fact that the perception exists. Perception drives decision-making, and decision-making drives outcomes. There's another layer here, one that's rarely captured in reports: the social environment inside custody. Inmate populations are not neutral. They are social organisms, with their own rules, hierarchies, and codes. Word travels fast, especially about high-profile cases. Nick Reiner's name, already associated with violence and suspicion, would have carried immediate weight. Other inmates do not see him as a name on a legal form. They see a story, amplified by rumor, exaggeration, and speculation. They see opportunity. They see threat. And staff? They see responsibility, oversight, liability. Every glance from staff, every interaction, is a calculation, a measure of control in an environment where control is constantly tested. The tension builds silently. It builds not in one dramatic event, but in a series of small decisions. A shift change, a cell assignment, a conversation that went unheard, a warning that was noted but never elevated. These elements coalesce into conditions that, when combined with chance, can become catastrophic. Meanwhile, media coverage escalates externally. Headlines position Nick Reiner not as a detainee, not as someone whose rights must be preserved, but as a villain whose fate is inevitable. Public opinion hardens quickly, sometimes before facts are confirmed. And perception from the outside can shape behavior on the inside, in ways that are subtle but impactful. By the time Nick reaches the detention facility, the narrative is already in motion. Custody procedures are being implemented, risk assessments made, decisions finalized. And yet, the system cannot entirely predict human behavior. There is always an element of unpredictability. In staff, in inmates, in the detainee himself, every interaction carries weight. A misunderstanding, a miscommunication, or a moment of vulnerability can cascade into consequences that are disproportionate to their origin. That's the fragility inherent in the system. And it's what makes this case, ultimately, more than a simple headline. The initial night, the arrest, the intake process, they are not just preliminaries. They are the foundation upon which everything else rests. And if that foundation is flawed, the structures above it, the custody, the observation, the legal process, can crumble before we even realize it. So we are left with a paradox. Procedures exist to prevent harm. Risk assessments exist to manage vulnerability. Protocols are written to guide action. Yet, in practice, these safeguards are filtered through human judgment, institutional pressure, and social dynamics, each introducing the possibility of failure. And that possibility was realized. But we are not at the end yet. Because even as the arrest sets the stage, the story is not complete without examining the world inside that guest house and the moments leading up to law enforcement's arrival. What was happening in the hours before the tragedy? What dynamics existed within the household? What warnings, subtle or overt, might have gone unnoticed? These are questions that will take us deeper into the sequence of events, exposing cracks in both family and institutional structures. Because if we want to understand how this cascade of events culminated in not just the initial deaths, but ultimately in Nick Reiner's own fatal encounter inside custody, we must follow the thread from beginning to end. And as we prepare to do that, one final thought lingers. Arrests, reports, custody, they are intended to bring order, to contain chaos, to deliver justice. But sometimes, the order imposed is only apparent. Beneath the surface, tension accumulates. Vulnerability persists, and small oversights, unnoticed in the moment, can lead to irreversible outcomes. The night of the arrest was the first pivot. Every choice after it, every procedural decision, every housing assignment, every observation mattered. And now, with the outcome tragically known, the consequences of those choices can be examined with clarity, even if we may never fully understand every motivation or misstep. The Brentwood estate. A sprawling property valued at $13.5 million. Marble floors, manicured gardens, security cameras. The kind of place people assume is insulated from danger. Protected, peaceful, safe. And yet, on that night, it became a site of unimaginable violence. 2 lives ended, 1 arrested, and 1, ultimately, fatally caught in the machinery of the system. Walking through the estate in our minds, it's impossible not to notice the contrast between appearance and reality. From the outside, everything suggested calm, wealth, stability, control. But control is never absolute, not in human systems, not in families, not in the spaces where relationships, tensions, and grudges coexist, sometimes quietly, sometimes explosively. The guest house, where Nick Reiner lived, sits a short distance from the main house. Close enough to be connected, distant enough to feel separate. That proximity would prove symbolic in ways no one expected. A physical separation that suggested safety. A psychological distance that perhaps amplified misperceptions. Inside the house, the events unfolded in a rhythm almost too subtle to trace until the aftermath forced it into clarity. The Reiners, elderly and reportedly frail, were vulnerable in ways both obvious and hidden. The daughter, Romy, 27, occupies the intermediary position between public and private, between family and law enforcement. She would be the one to discover the bodies, the one to report the potential threat, the one whose testimony, even if informal, became a critical starting point for law enforcement. We don't know, and may never fully know, what went through her mind in that moment. Shock, fear, disbelief, perhaps a quick, instinctive calculus. Who could have done this? What should I do first? Which voices do I listen to? Her reported identification of a dangerous family member points to one of the first cracks in the narrative that would dominate media coverage: suspicion, guided by knowledge, but also by emotional proximity. That identification, publicized quickly, began shaping perception. It framed Nick not just as a suspect, but as someone inherently dangerous. And framing matters, especially before a trial, before evidence is fully tested, before law and public opinion have had their measured say. By the time officers arrived, the family's private space had already become a stage for the public story. The dynamics within that estate, moments of tension, interactions, subtle signs, were now only visible in hindsight. Each movement, each glance, each exchange could be analyzed for clues. But in real time, they were ephemeral. Nick Reiner's position in the guest house is also worth noting. Physically close, yet separated from the main household, it placed him in a liminal zone. Connected but apart. That liminality mirrors the larger pattern of how his life would unfold, present at the center of events, yet increasingly peripheral in the narrative of accountability, eventually silenced by circumstances outside his control. We also have to consider the logistics of law enforcement at that stage. Officers arriving at a high-profile scene navigate multiple layers, securing the property, ensuring safety, processing evidence, interviewing witnesses. Every step is governed by protocol, yet every protocol is interpreted by humans operating under stress, fatigue, and incomplete information. Errors, oversights, and assumptions can arise from this environment without malice, and yet the consequences are real. Inside the main house, the bodies of Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, were discovered. Early reports suggest stabbing. The method, location, and timing all feed into the initial narrative, yet remain incompletely verified. For a family home, the scene was extraordinary in its sudden rupture of normality. Bedrooms, living areas, hallways, every space transformed from domestic familiarity into evidence. And the emotional imprint of that transformation is difficult to overstate. The shock for a 27-year-old discovering this scene, the disruption of a household that had existed, until that moment, in relative stability. The guest house's proximity also factors into how Nick Reiner was perceived. Authorities, responding to Romy's account, would have understood physical closeness as a potential vector of culpability. It's a simple logic. The suspect is near the crime scene. Yet, physical proximity alone is not proof, and in moments of crisis, assumptions often fill gaps left by absent evidence. That dynamic, the collision of geography, perception, and legal interpretation, is subtle but critical. There are also questions about timing. How long before law enforcement arrived? How much of the initial timeline is accurate? Witness statements, logs, and early media reports often conflict. In cases like this, minor discrepancies can carry outsized significance, shaping later interpretations, influencing decisions, and even altering public perception. Within the estate, emotional dynamics cannot be overlooked. Families are complicated, and tension is rarely absent. While there's no evidence to suggest premeditation from anyone other than what authorities allege regarding Nick, the mere presence of interpersonal stressors adds layers to how events unfold. Fear, irritation, disagreement, history, these factors exist quietly in every household. In a crisis, They can amplify or distort behavior in ways that are nearly impossible to reconstruct fully after the fact. And yet, the narrative that emerged focused almost exclusively on the suspect in the guest house. It's a framing that simplifies complex realities, a family tragedy condensed into a figure, a location, a headline. The rest, the context, the patterns, the subtle emotional cues, recede, leaving a stark portrait: suspect, victims, arrest. This simplification has consequences. It drives both legal interpretation and media framing. It influences how custody decisions are made later. It shapes public expectation. And in the long run, it may obscure procedural questions that could explain how subsequent events, including Nick Reiner's death in custody, came to pass. By walking through the estate, through the family's spatial and emotional landscape, we can see how vulnerability, perception, and misalignment of expectations created conditions that were precarious from the start. The family's tragedy was immediate, violent, and personal. But it also set into motion structural consequences: an arrest, custody, and eventually, a fatal exposure to risk. The Brentwood estate, in all its size and security, becomes a metaphor. Wealth and property do not immunize a household from chaos. Physical separation does not equate to psychological safety. And proximity, even measured, procedural proximity, can transform suspicion into narrative authority. As night fell and officers began their work, the first critical decisions were being made: how to secure the property, how to isolate evidence, how to approach the suspect. Every procedural choice, from questioning to movement to housing, would ripple forward. Each decision was informed by what was known, what was reported, and what assumptions were drawn. And assumptions, particularly under stress, are rarely neutral. By examining the estate itself, its architecture, its spaces, the physical distances between family members, and the guest house where Nick lived, we can begin to see how geography and human judgment intersected to produce the sequence of outcomes that followed. The estate is not just backdrop. It is an active component of the story, a stage on which procedural, social, and emotional dynamics interacted with fatal consequences. And as we leave the estate behind in this reconstruction, a new question emerges. How did those decisions, taken in the immediate aftermath of the arrest and discovery, translate into custodial conditions? How did placement, observation, and classification in the days that followed set the stage for the fatal encounter inside custody? The answer, in part, lies in the next chapter: the transition from suspect to inmate, from family drama to institutional control. Because the environment inside custody is very different from a private home. And the rules, the pressures, and the risks shift dramatically. The moment Nick Reiner crossed the threshold from private citizen to detainee, the world changed. Not for him alone, but for everyone connected to the unfolding tragedy. Arrest is a procedural act, a formality in legal terms, but its psychological weight is immense. 1 minute, you're at home, surrounded by family and familiarity. The next, you are inside a law enforcement vehicle, moving toward an institution designed to contain, monitor, and control. That transition is rarely smooth. It is mechanical in appearance. Officers read rights, check identification, transport protocols are followed. Yet beneath the surface, the transformation is total. Autonomy is stripped away. Identity is compressed into classification codes. Every movement is tracked, every statement recorded. The legal system expects compliance, while the carceral environment demands adaptation. And adaptation in such circumstances is not optional. It is survival. From the moment of intake, Nick's life was restructured by a combination of documentation, observation, and institutional expectation. Forms were filled, risk assessments initiated, preliminary housing decisions made. The intake officer doesn't know the whole person. The officer only knows what is reported, what is visible, and what must be acted upon according to policy. Missing data is interpreted conservatively, often defaulting to the safe side of administrative logic. But safe is relative, especially in a volatile environment. High-profile detainees carry a unique burden. Nick's alleged involvement in the deaths of his parents meant he would be scrutinized differently than a standard detainee. Information travels fast among inmates. Reputation precedes presence. Within the first hours, the social ecosystem inside the facility begins to position newcomers. Alliances are formed. Status is negotiated. Threats are evaluated. A single name can incite fear, resentment, or opportunism. And even without direct evidence of intent, the perception of threat is enough to make someone a target. At the same time, staff operate under pressure. Their responsibilities are manifold: ensuring the safety of the detainee, maintaining order in the population, monitoring interactions, and documenting incidents. Each of these tasks requires attention to detail and constant situational awareness. But human factors, fatigue, stress, distraction, introduce vulnerability. Decisions made under these conditions have outsized consequences. A housing choice, a missed warning, a delayed response, can shift outcomes from manageable to catastrophic. The classification process is particularly critical. Intake officers and supervisors must decide: general population, protective custody, or observation. Risk assessment forms, behavioral histories, and case profiles guide these decisions. Each designation comes with its own protocols for monitoring, movement, and interaction. For someone like Nick, these choices were not abstract. They determined proximity to potential threats and the level of supervision he would receive in the hours and days ahead. Yet the system is never perfect. Overcrowding, staff shortages, and administrative bottlenecks can compromise even well-intentioned protocols. Protective measures are implemented based on assessment. Institutionally, the death of a detainee while in custody triggers multiple layers of inquiry. Internal review, external oversight, and potentially criminal investigation all follow. But early narratives, inmate-on-inmate violence, fatal altercation, isolated incident, often shape public perception before those investigations are complete. Language is powerful. The framing can imply inevitability, randomness, or uncontrollable circumstances, even when structural failures played a role. The assault itself, while still under formal review, illustrates the limits of procedural safeguards. Observation protocols, staffing ratios, and housing assignments are designed to reduce risk, but they are not foolproof. They rely on adherence, accuracy, and timely judgment. Each layer of protection can fail, and when it does, consequences are immediate and irreversible. In analyzing the conditions of the assault, we must consider the interaction of multiple factors: the detainee's profile, housing assignments, inmate social dynamics, staff observation, procedural adherence, and the unpredictable element of human behavior. The fatal outcome was not a single event, but the product of a cascading sequence, each step amplifying risk. There is also the matter of post-incident procedure. When a detainee dies, authorities must respond, secure the scene, notify next of kin, document evidence, and begin investigation. Every action is scrutinized. Every misstep can be interpreted as negligence. In high-profile cases, public and media attention intensifies pressure on officials, potentially shaping both reporting and internal decision-making. Psychologically, for the family and public, the death of Nick Reiner inside custody creates a dissonance. The person accused of violent crime becomes a victim of institutional failure. That reversal complicates perception, emotional response, and narrative framing. It is a tragedy layered upon tragedy. 2 lives lost at the Brentwood estate, and then a 3rd life extinguished in a place designed to contain and control risk. Legally, the implications are complex. Charges against Nick are rendered moot by death. Proceedings cannot continue. Evidence collected prior to custody may now exist without the opportunity for cross-examination or defense. Investigations into the assault may shift focus from criminal intent to procedural adequacy. Responsibility may diffuse across systemic layers: staff, administration, policy, structural design. And yet, the questions remain. Why was protective custody not considered sufficient? Were risk assessments accurate? Were staff protocols properly followed? Were early indicators of tension noted and escalated? And fundamentally, could this have been prevented? The answers to these questions are critical, not only for accountability in this case, but for understanding systemic vulnerabilities that exist in similar institutions. They demand scrutiny, careful analysis, and transparency, none of which can fully undo the consequences, but all of which are essential to preventing recurrence. As we examine the fatal assault, the surrounding conditions, and the immediate aftermath, one clear pattern emerges. The tragedy was not sudden in its entirety. It was the result of layered, escalating risk, procedural, social, and psychological, intersecting in a space where minor miscalculations can have irreversible consequences. The next chapter will shift focus outward from the incident itself to the broader response. The silence, the institutional statements, the media narrative, and the first signals of public reaction. Because the story is not only about what happened in custody, but also about how those events are interpreted, framed, and recorded, shaping perception long before investigations conclude. The immediate silence that followed the fatal incident was deafening in its implications. Not the absence of sound. Custodial environments are never quiet, but the absence of information. A pause in communication. A gap between what was known internally and what was released externally. That silence, subtle as it may seem, spoke volumes. For the public, the confirmation from former Attorney General Pam Bondi was the first official acknowledgement of Nick Reiner's death. 3 phrases: fatal assault, other inmates, in custody. Brief, factual, and chilling. But notice what was missing: context, causation, procedural detail, explanation. The gaps matter because they create space for assumptions, speculation, and, crucially, narrative framing. Silence is a tool. Institutions use it both consciously and unconsciously. To contain panic, to manage perception, to allow processes to unfold without interference. But silence also shapes storylines. When information is withheld or delayed, the first narrative to fill that vacuum becomes dominant. In this case, the initial framing, that Nick Reiner was beaten by other inmates, arrived before independent investigation, before logs could be cross-checked, before family statements were fully incorporated. This is not unusual. In high-profile custodial deaths, early official language often emphasizes randomness or environmental inevitability, isolated incident, tragic event, inmate-on-inmate violence. The framing conveys that what happened was sudden, unavoidable, and outside institutional control. Yet the truth is rarely so simple. Each procedural choice leading up to the incident, housing assignment, observation levels, staff allocation, sets the stage for outcome. Institutional communication also reflects legal caution. Words are deliberately chosen to limit liability. Ambiguity becomes protection, but ambiguity has consequences. It shapes perception, often more effectively than facts. Public opinion, media narratives, and internal morale are influenced not by what occurred, but by how it is described. The silence also extended to the family. Romy Reiner, the daughter who discovered her parents' bodies, was thrust into public attention, the first source of narrative, yet likely had limited information about her brother's fate. Communication from custodial authorities to next of kin is highly regulated, often delayed for procedural reasons. But the emotional impact of this gap is profound. She experienced a dual layer of trauma, discovering the initial tragedy and then, potentially, being left uncertain about her brother's status. Meanwhile, the media narrative quickly solidified around key facts. Nick Reiner was arrested. His parents were dead. He was now deceased in custody. Simplification is necessary for headlines, but simplification can distort reality. The nuance of procedural breakdown, institutional oversight, and social dynamics inside custody largely disappeared from initial coverage. Instead, the story presented itself as linear: suspect, arrest, detention, fatal outcome. From an analytical standpoint, this is critical. The initial framing often becomes the lens through which subsequent analysis is conducted. Investigators, legal analysts, and journalists are all influenced, even unconsciously, by first impressions. Subsequent revelations must compete with an established narrative, which can make uncovering procedural lapses or structural failures more challenging. Internally, custodial systems respond differently to high-profile incidents than routine ones. Administrative review is launched, often rapidly. Staff are interviewed. Logs and surveillance are analyzed. But these processes are confidential. Public information emerges slowly, if at all. The lag between internal review and external reporting allows assumptions to solidify. Early silence may give an impression of clarity while the institution grapples with complexity internally. Another layer is psychological. When an unexpected death occurs in custody, staff experience stress, guilt, and scrutiny. Operational pressures amplify. Reporting structures tighten. Decisions about what information to release externally are influenced by multiple considerations: legal liability, media reaction, institutional reputation, and procedural fairness. Every word is measured. Every statement carries potential ramifications. The public, however, is left to interpret gaps. What does fatal assault by other inmates imply? Was it spontaneous? Pre-planned? A lapse in supervision? A failure in classification? Questions proliferate because the official statement is silent on mechanisms, context, and causality. Silence, in this sense, becomes a narrative agent itself, shaping thought as much as spoken words do. It is also notable how quickly public discussion turned to systemic failure. Social media, forums, and commentary channels highlighted perceived lapses. Insufficient staffing, flawed observation, inadequate protective measures. The dialogue was speculative but persistent. And speculation, especially when official information is sparse, can solidify into perceived truth. Simultaneously, procedural ambiguity persists. Custodial environments operate on layers of policy, discretion, and human judgment. Observation logs may exist, but how diligently they are followed is subject to variability. Warnings may be issued, but escalation depends on human interpretation. Each layer introduces potential points of failure. When combined with the psychological and social pressures already present, the system is vulnerable. And yet, despite these complexities, early reporting sought closure. Short statements. Headlines. Certainty. For institutions, certainty in narrative is protective. For the public, certainty is comforting. But reality is rarely so neat. The interplay of human behavior, institutional protocols, and social dynamics is not easily summarized. The incident was not a single moment in isolation. It was the culmination of an environment layered with tension, procedural gaps, and misaligned perception. It is also worth considering temporal dynamics. Media coverage moves faster than institutional review. Public perception solidifies while internal processes are still ongoing. In this case, the official acknowledgement. Bondi's confirmation arrived quickly, giving weight to the narrative before procedural analysis was publicly available. Early perception, once fixed, is difficult to shift. Later clarification may be ignored or discounted, not because it is incorrect, but because it competes with the initial story. The silence following the confirmation also highlights the emotional stakes for those directly involved. Staff, family, and fellow detainees all navigate a reality shaped by both what is known and what is unknown. The absence of explanation can amplify fear, guilt, confusion, and mistrust. For the family, the lack of clarity compounds grief. For the staff, it intensifies scrutiny. For the system, it represents an unresolved challenge, balancing confidentiality with accountability. Ultimately, the silence, the selective release of information, and the rapid narrative framing create a landscape in which perception often substitutes for fact. What emerges publicly is a story that seems complete, when in reality, it is provisional, constructed, and constrained by institutional discretion. And as we consider these dynamics, the pressing question remains: what does this silence mean for accountability? For truth? For understanding the complex series of events that led to a fatality inside custody, following a high-profile arrest in a family tragedy? The next chapter will explore the family's aftermath, the emotional fallout, and how grief, suspicion, and media attention intersect in the days following the deaths. Because while procedural failure and institutional silence matter, so too does the human dimension. The way lives, perceptions, and relationships are reshaped by a sequence of events that began long before custody and will resonate far beyond it. The aftermath of the Brentwood tragedy and Nick Reiner's subsequent death in custody is a landscape both emotional and complex. It is not a simple story of cause and effect, but an intersection of grief, suspicion, procedural scrutiny, and public perception. To understand the full scope, we must begin with the family. Romy Reiner, the daughter who discovered her parents' bodies, occupies a particularly pivotal position. She is both witness and participant, observer and narrator, bearing firsthand trauma that immediately shapes the initial narrative. Imagine the psychological weight of that moment, stepping into a home you associate with safety and familiarity, only to find it transformed into a scene of horror. Her alleged identification of a dangerous family member was more than a statement to police. It became a framing device for media coverage and investigative focus. In the days following the discovery, Romy, like many in her position, would have been navigating multiple, conflicting demands. Police required information for the ongoing investigation. Media outlets sought comment and confirmation. Internal family dynamics were inevitably tense, with grief intersecting with suspicion, blame, and unresolved questions. The burden of being the intermediary, the one to report, explain, and answer, is enormous. The emotional stakes extend to every member of the Reiner family. Loss at this scale is transformative, but when compounded by the uncertainty surrounding Nick, the psychological complexity intensifies. On one hand, they are mourning the sudden death of parents. On the other, they are grappling with a brother now dead under circumstances equally violent and perplexing. The human mind struggles to process layers of trauma, particularly when information is incomplete and the narrative is fractured. Media coverage in this period is particularly influential. Headlines condense tragedy into easily digestible phrases: double homicide, son arrested, detainee killed in custody. These simplifications amplify emotional responses while flattening complexity. Nuances, procedural gaps, institutional pressures, social dynamics within custody are overshadowed by the immediacy of shock. Public perception forms rapidly, often solidifying before investigators have the chance to clarify details. The family's internal dynamics are equally complicated. The Reiners are not isolated from societal pressures. Wealth, status, and visibility amplify scrutiny. Every movement, statement, and social media post is interpreted, judged, and circulated. In such contexts, grief is not private. It becomes performative and mediated, filtered through public expectation and media framing. The burden of expectation can alter behavior, influence statements, and shape decisions in ways that are subtle yet consequential. Legal considerations also dominate the aftermath. Nick Reiner's arrest initiated a series of procedural events, from custody hearings to preliminary investigations. Yet his subsequent death halted the normal legal process. Without a living defendant, cross-examination, testimony, and trial proceedings were impossible. The judicial process was interrupted, leaving gaps in evidence evaluation and procedural closure. These gaps have implications not only for justice in the immediate case, but also for understanding the systemic factors that contributed to the outcome. Public reaction during this period oscillated between shock, outrage, and speculation. Social media amplified unverified reports, conflicting accounts, and conjecture. Discussions often focused on culpability and institutional responsibility, but rarely addressed the procedural subtleties of custody or the social dynamics that might have influenced events. In this context, perception increasingly substitutes for documented fact. Early narratives, simplified, urgent, emotionally charged, dominate public understanding and, in turn, influence investigative priorities. Institutional responses during the aftermath are similarly constrained. Law enforcement and custodial authorities must balance transparency with procedural integrity. Statements are calibrated, careful, and often incomplete, creating tension between public expectation and administrative caution. Delays or omissions, though often procedural, are perceived as evasive, further complicating the family's understanding of events and fueling speculation. The interplay of media coverage, institutional communication, and family response creates a feedback loop. Public speculation influences institutional behavior. Institutional behavior shapes media reporting. Media reporting informs family perception. Each component amplifies uncertainty, emotional stress, and the demand for rapid clarity, even as the underlying reality remains complex, multifaceted, and opaque. Psychologically, this environment is intense. Grief, guilt, shock, and fear intersect with the procedural uncertainty surrounding custody and investigation. Each family member experiences trauma differently, and the visibility of the event magnifies emotional responses. Public expectation, scrutiny, and commentary add layers of stress, making private processing of grief almost impossible. Additionally, systemic stress within the custodial environment contributes to the narrative. Staff and administrators respond to high-profile attention while managing operational duties. Internal reviews, procedural audits, and documentation all occur under scrutiny. The tension between operational capacity and public visibility introduces subtle pressures that influence decision-making and risk assessment. Social perception, both inside and outside the institution, shapes behavior. Detainees interpret status, reputation, and threat through available information, often incomplete or distorted. Staff interpret detainee behavior through policy and protocol, but also influenced by prior knowledge, assumptions, and workload. Family members interpret events through observation, media coverage, and personal experience. Each perspective is valid, yet partial, creating a mosaic of understanding that is never complete. These overlapping perspectives reveal a critical insight. The tragedy is not isolated to the event itself. It is systemic, relational, and cumulative. Multiple layers of vulnerability, procedural, social, emotional, institutional, converge to produce an outcome that feels sudden but is, in reality, the product of extended, interacting factors. And yet, even amid this complexity, accountability is diffuse. Staff acted according to protocol, but protocol has limits. Administrators respond according to regulation, but regulations cannot anticipate every contingency. The legal system functions as designed, yet its mechanisms were interrupted by circumstances beyond its procedural logic. The emotional weight for the family, meanwhile, continues to build. Grief intertwines with anger, with confusion, and with an intense need for understanding. The absence of closure, a trial, a detailed explanation, a transparent account, leaves questions unresolved, lingering, and emotionally destabilizing. Public perception mirrors this complexity. Simplified narratives dominate, yet they fail to capture the procedural and social intricacies that shaped the event. The challenge is twofold: interpreting what happened and recognizing the conditions that allowed it to happen. In other words, understanding the human story and the systemic story simultaneously. As we explore the aftermath, we begin to see patterns. Patterns in family response, patterns in institutional behavior, patterns in media coverage. These patterns reveal not only how grief and trauma propagate, but also how accountability, or the perception of accountability, is constructed and communicated. And as we examine these layers, one unsettling realization emerges. The narrative of closure is largely external. Internally, questions persist. Logs, reports, and procedural due